All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming by and checking out my presentation today. Today, I will be presenting on mycology, the scientific study of fungi. So, cool. Yeah, so I'm really passionate about learning about mushrooms. I think mushrooms are really cool for a lot of reasons. They can be used as traditional medicine, food, tinder, and they also have psychoactive effects, which are very interesting. They are also, some of them are poisonous, and there's just a very broad array of things that mushrooms can be used for or can do, and I find that really interesting. So for today's presentation, I'm going to be using this basic fungal life cycle as a type of, as a kind of guideline for the presentation. So, as we can see, the first thing that I think is really important to note is that when we think about plants in general, we think about seeds. Trees or flowers oftentimes come from seeds, but unlike most plants, mushrooms come from spores, which are really just fungal cells, as we will see. So just keep this in mind that we start as a spore and we move to a germinate, a mycelia, a primordia, and a fruiting body, which then releases spores and the cycle starts anew. So let's talk a little bit more about spores. So I mentioned before that the spores are really just fungal cells. And as we can see here, I put a plant cell next to a fungal cell, and it's pertinent to note that the fungal cell has several things that the plant cell does not. And that's a bud seen here at the top, the septum, which separates the main part of the cell from the bud, and the bud scar at the bottom. And so in nature, when spores find each other, two spores meet in soil or wherever, they come together and they pretty much reproduce, and they end up with this thing called a zygospore. And that will be important as we move forward to talk about mycelium. But for now, you could direct your attention to this little puffball mushroom on the right here, and you see this kind of dust that it's ejecting out. That's actually, those are little spores that it's ejecting, and I thought that was a cool picture to include here. And then also, you can see the spore prints on the top right. These are kind of like fingerprints, but for mushrooms. And I think that they're pretty cool. You can see that different mushrooms have different spore prints, whether it's the size, the color, and these are taken by cutting the cap off of the mushroom and placing it on a piece of foil or a piece of paper and leaving it there for several hours. And just naturally, the spores will fall down out of the gills of the mushroom and leave a kind of spore print here. So I thought that was cool to include. So the mycelium, just keeping in mind that fungal life cycle, the mycelium, what is the mycelium? The mycelium is really like the main body of the mushroom. We think about mushrooms and that they're popping up, and that's the plant. But in reality, the main part of the mushroom is underground. It's not seen, and it takes the form of this mycelium. The mycelium, and I've heard it been described as like an apple tree, whereas an apple is like a mushroom, and the tree is like the mycelium. So if you think about it like that, the only purpose of the mushroom to come up is for it to reproduce, because it's in the mushroom body that the spores are dropped, and then the mushroom is able to reproduce. So yeah, you can kind of see there. You could think of these like roots. Essentially, they're a bit different, but they're similar to roots in some ways. And yeah, and a mycorrhizae relationship is like a symbiotic relationship between mycelium and plants. And in this next slide here, we see a really cool visual representation of that. So here we have a couple different mushrooms, and these are, the mycelium that are going down to the to meet the roots of this tree here. And there's this symbiotic mycorrhizae relationship where the mushroom will kind of transport nutrients. The mushroom will transport carbon dioxide to the tree because the tree consumes carbon dioxide, whereas the mushroom consumes oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. So in return, the tree gives the mushroom nutrients, so that there's this really cool relationship. And this happens not just with trees, but with other plants as well. So the next kind of step in this mushroom cycle, the life cycle, is the fruiting body. And like I mentioned before, the fruiting body is really, the main purpose of it is for reproduction, similar to the apple tree, whereas the seeds are in the apple, the spores are in the mushroom. And here you can see a Amanita muscaria mushroom, and this is the veil right here, if you can see my mouse, above the stalk. And that veil once surrounded the entire kind of circumference of the mushroom here. And what happens is, at a certain point in the life cycle of the mushroom, as it's growing and maturing, the veil breaks. And when this veil breaks, it falls down onto the stalk. And this allows for the spores, which are all inside of the gills here of the mushroom, to be released and fall down. And that's how, you know, the spore prints are taken. So yeah, all right, let's keep going. So yeah, here are some fruiting bodies, also called sporocarps. And this is a reishi ganadernum mushroom, really powerful medicinal Eastern medicine mushroom. I believe these are chicken of the woods, which is another edible mushroom. Here we have some lion's mane, which is very powerful for cognitive benefits, and just some really kind of pretty pictures of mushrooms that I enjoyed here. So now it's normally like around this time in the presentation that people are like, wow, this is really cool, but what about the psychedelic mushrooms? And so I didn't forget about those. So we have some slides that we'll go over on two different genus of psychoactive mushrooms. The first of which being the genus Psilocybe, probably the one that most people think about when thinking about magic mushrooms. These are the shrooms. These are the genus Psilocybe mushrooms. So on the other side here, we have the Amanita genus, and these are also psychoactive. However, they're probably not what comes to mind when you think of magic mushrooms. These are very different from the Psilocybe mushrooms, and we'll talk about that in more detail as we go on. All right, so the Psilocybe mushrooms. The first thing that I want to say about these mushrooms is that they grow naturally all around the world. They love humid climates, but most places, most continents, you can find magic mushrooms growing in the wild. So that's pretty interesting. I'm really interested in neuroscience, so I'm going to briefly touch on the kind of mechanism of action that allows for these mushrooms to become psychoactive and allows for these kind of altered states of consciousness to arise. So when you consume a magic mushroom, you're really eating the psilocybin, so-called psilocybin, which is a psychoactive molecule that's the primary psychoactive ingredient in the mushroom. But it turns out that this psilocybin can't really be processed or brought up to the brain. So in the stomach, the psilocybin is converted through stomach acids and other biological processes to this just kind of simplified version of psilocybin called psilocin. And the psilocin is then able to get into the bloodstream, unlike the psilocybin, and from there it makes its way up to the brain, where it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And once it's inside of the brain, this psilocin has a very strong liking for serotonin receptors in the brain, and that's largely due to its molecular shape. So yeah, and there's many different serotonin receptors. I believe 12 or 14, if I'm not mistaken. 1A, 1B, so on. So the the particular subtype of serotonin receptors that the psilocybin, or the psilocin rather, is interested in are the 2A receptors, the serotonin 2A receptors. And with that said, there is additional binding on some of the other receptors, the 1A and several other receptors, but the strongest connections are made at this 2A receptor. And you might wonder, all right, well, that's interesting. What is the 2A receptor, and what is it, what does it do when it's not being agonized by psilocybin or psilocin? And to answer that, I would refer you to this article. I believe it's available for free, by Ari Bauer and Robin Carhart Harris. And in this article, the authors go into great detail talking about the different, talking about the 2A receptor and what it is and what it's really, what we know about it. So a really great article. And yeah, so this would not be a proper psilocybin slide if I did not pay homage to the great Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec curandera from the Oaxaca region of Mexico. And she's kind of credited as being one of the more, one of the most important players in this story of how magic mushrooms came to be known in the public. And the traditions that are associated with magic mushrooms or psilocybe mushrooms date back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in this Oaxaca region of Mexico, it's been part of the culture for a very long time. And so Maria Sabina, this medicine woman, she crossed paths with a New York banker, R. Gordon Wasson, and she really showed him the ways in which this mushroom was used. And Gordon Wasson had an interest in magic mushrooms and mycology, so I believe he sought Maria Sabina out and learned from her. And so Maria gave Gordon Wasson permission to take this knowledge that she shared with him and bring it back to America and kind of bring it to the public. The way in which it was revealed is that R. Gordon Wasson wrote an article which was published in 1957 in Life magazine. I don't believe that this magazine is is printed anymore, but it's a famous article and you can still find it. And this was the first kind of information that came to the public about magic mushrooms. And this is the very rough draft of the story. And so I included How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, a UC Berkeley professor. And Michael Pollan goes into great detail talking about this story and kind of elucidating some of the details that I have probably missed. So feel free to check that out. It's a great book. I would strongly recommend it. I think the reception was great when it came out. And on another thing that I would like to direct your attention to on the slide is this article here by Roland Griffiths, or primary author Roland Griffiths. And this was a 2006 paper that is kind of talked about as being one of the more important papers that brought forth the knowledge of the benefits and this kind of spiritual significance of magic mushrooms to research scientists. And that's a really important paper. So I linked it here. And yeah, you could find it. It's also available for free, I believe, online. And then we'll just talk about these photos real quick, and then we'll move forward. So these are the wavy cap, or the Psilocybe azurensis mushrooms, first discovered by Paul Stamets. And they're known to be particularly strong, high psilocybin content. This mushroom, I included this on the slide because you can see that it's kind of bruised blue here. And this is a hallmark kind of characteristic of magic mushrooms. The psilocybin containing mushrooms is that if you kind of touch them a bit, they will, within a couple seconds, bruise this very, really beautiful kind of dark blue color. So yeah, and here you could also see these are the veils that we spoke earlier a little bit about that have broken away from the cap of the mushroom, and now this mushroom is going to be releasing its spores, and you could even see a little darkness right there. That would be some of the spores falling. So we will move on now to the Amanita mushrooms. Very, very different mushrooms, also psychoactive. So the first thing that that I want to note is that these are poisonous mushrooms. You know, these are not to be messed with mushrooms. And some of them are more poisonous than others. So for example, this mushroom right here on the bottom right, the Amanita phallodius, is also commonly referred to as the death cap mushroom, and you don't want to eat that. That would probably, you know, kill you. So in the same genus, we have the Amanita muscaria, or sometimes referred to as, you know, the Santa Claus mushroom, which probably won't kill you, but also has some dangerous alkaloids in them that you would not necessarily want to consume if you are a novice, you know, mushroom aficionado. So proceed with caution. But I wanted to kind of talk about the different mechanism of action that these mushrooms have compared to the previous category. And whereas the other ones where we were dealing with psilocybin and then psilocin, here we're dealing with muscarine and muscimol. And these compounds they go up into the brain, and if consumed, they have an affinity for this GABA A, specifically the GABA A delta receptors, where they act as agonists. So, you know, serotonin in the previous example, that's a neuromodulator. In other words, you know, it modulates the excitation of glutamate, and whereas these are, you know, glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter, whereas GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so, you know, you think, okay, well, whereas psilocybin is exciting these neurons, the GABA is actually suppressing activity within the brain. So it's a completely different mechanism that's going on here, and really interesting. So I just wanted to mention that and just note that there's a very big difference what's happening in the brain. I think it's really interesting. There's this kind of controversial book that I wanted to include by John Marco Allegro, and it's called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And in the book, the author kind of alludes, or he doesn't really allude, he sets the stage for this narrative. I haven't read the book, so I'm just giving a synopsis of what I have heard of the book, but essentially that the Judeo-Christian values and kind of origin took root from this Amanita muscaria mushroom. And yeah, it's very controversial. I'm interested in reading it. I have not read it yet, but for those of you who are interested in taking a deeper dive into this Amanita world, this is a good place to look. Additionally, I have up here in the top right this article. I believe it's free. It might not be, but from Elsevier, and this is just a kind of overview of the Amanita muscaria and looking at the different you know, biological aspects of this this mushroom. Yeah, what's very fascinating about the Amanita muscaria in particular is that there's a very, very rich history going back to ancient Siberian shamanism. This mushroom grows. You can't grow this mushroom, to my knowledge, by itself. It has to be grown near a pine tree, or it just grows rather near a pine tree, because there is some kind of a symbiotic relationship between the pine tree and the Amanita muscaria, that it must be those conditions in order for the mushroom to grow. And legend has it, or from what I've heard, the ancient Siberian shamans would kind of pick these mushrooms and place them to dry on the pine tree, or under the pine tree. And you know, if you use your imagination, you could imagine that the bright red with the white dots kind of looks like a Christmas present. So you know, who knows? But if you are interested in hearing more about this connection and the history of the Amanita muscaria, I would recommend checking out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, episode 130 with Tero Isikuplia. I might be mispronouncing that. I apologize if I am. But he's one of the founders of the mushroom coffee company Four Sigmatic, which has wonderful products. I really enjoy the mushroom coffee that they make. They have a little pop-up shop, or perhaps it's a regular shop in on Abbot Kinney in Venice Beach, California. A really cool store, and I think that their whole product line is very cool. And so this guy goes into great detail about the story and the history of this. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say about the Amanita mushrooms. And we can move forward. And so we just kind of come to these main takeaways. And those are to always do, your research when dealing with mushrooms, because like we've seen, they can be medicinal, they can be psychoactive, they can be poisonous. And it's really important to know what you are dealing with. And this goes hand in hand with the second bullet point of just be careful when foraging. I've gone out several times myself looking for mushrooms in the wild, and you don't, unless you've done your research beforehand, you may think that you have something that's edible, but in fact it's not, and it might even be poisonous. And we have to be very careful when foraging. And the second bullet point is just kind of a little reminder just to be careful in general, because a lot of crazy things going on in our world. But and yes, respect Mother Nature. These crazy beautiful mushrooms. This is called an inky cap. You can see this ink kind of looking stuff is dripping down, and eventually the cap will roll up onto itself and it kind of melts. And it's a beautiful, beautiful mushroom. These are blue oyster mushrooms, and this is a chaga mushroom, which is very popular medicinal mushroom, has a lot of health benefits as well. So that is my presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and thank you for sticking with me and watching my presentation.